You know, when the pressure's on, that's when you really see what a leader is made of. But what happens when the stakes aren't just hitting a deadline, but literally life and death? We're about to dive into one of the most intense crisis situations in modern history to pull out a playbook for leading when there is absolutely no room for error.
It's just 6 words, but man, did they change everything. With that simple, chillingly calm phrase from Commander Jim Lovell, what was supposed to be a routine trip to the moon became one of the most nail-biting rescue missions ever. 200,000 miles from home, disaster struck, and the entire world just held its breath.
So what happened? Well, an oxygen tank literally blew up, and it completely crippled their command module. Just like that, the moon landing, off the table. The new mission, the only mission, was just to get these 3 guys home alive. Down in Houston, for Mission Director Gene Kranz and his team, the challenge was almost unimaginable. They had to invent solutions to problems nobody had ever even thought of before, and they had to do it on the fly.
And that, right there, is the big question. This isn't really about space travel, is it? It's about how you lead people through pure chaos. How do you find your way through that fog of war, when you've got bad information, insane levels of stress, and failure is not an option? Well, as we're going to see, the answer isn't some single flash of brilliance. It's a process.
So you might think the rescue of Apollo 13 was some kind of miracle, right? No, it was the result of a systematic, repeatable playbook for getting things done that the team followed almost by instinct. It's a framework that can take total chaos and turn it into a series of manageable steps.
That framework is something Professor Don Saul calls the execution loop, and it's pretty brilliant. It's this cycle of 4 phases that you just keep running. First, you make sense of what's actually going on. Then you make choices about what to do. Third, you make it happen, you take action. And last, you make revisions as things change, which, guess what, feeds right back into making sense of the new situation. It's a loop that just keeps going. Let's break down how Gene Kranz's team ran this loop to perfection.
Okay, let's dive into step 1. Make sense. I mean, when disaster hits, your first instinct might be to do something, anything. But a leader's first job is actually to cut through all that noise, ignore the panicked opinions, and just figure out the facts. What is really happening right now?
And this is where it gets super interesting. You've got 2 ways this can go. On the one hand, you have groupthink, where everybody just nods along with the first idea that sounds halfway decent. But Gene Kranz, he fought that tooth and nail. He created a culture with what he called an obligation to dissent. He literally went around the room demanding, what are the facts? Don't tell me what you think, tell me what you know. So when somebody suggested, oh, it's probably just a faulty sensor, it was the hard facts, Lovell actually seeing gas venting into space, the oxygen levels plummeting, that got them to the truth. Dissent wasn't just allowed, it was required.
All right, so you've got the facts. Now what? You got to decide what to do. This is the strategy part of the loop. Step 2 is all about making clear, purposeful choices. And that means deciding not just what you are going to do, but also, and this is just as important, what you are not going to do.
You know, it's so easy to fall into this trap where you just grab the first idea that sounds good and run with it. Kranz's team actively avoided that. They insisted on exploring multiple options. For example, should they just turn the ship around and burn all their remaining fuel to get home fast? It was an option. Or should they do something kind of crazy and use the moon's gravity to slingshot the spacecraft back to Earth? By forcing themselves to come up with several real, viable options, a principle, sometimes called the rule of 3, they could make a truly smart choice instead of just a fast one.
And this is where Gene Kranz drops one of the most famous lines in history. When he said, failure is not an option, it wasn't just a cool-sounding line for a movie. It was a strategic decision. He was publicly making a choice. He was saying what they would not do. They would not give up. And with that, he focused every single person, every resource, on one single, crystal-clear objective: bring those astronauts home. The moon mission was dead. Survival was now the whole game.
Okay, so you have a strategy. Awesome. But a plan is just a piece of paper until you actually do something. That brings us to step 3. Make it happen. This is all about turning those choices into real-world action, and it all boils down to 2 things: commitment and accountability.
And here's the key difference, right? There's a world of difference between a quiet, private promise and a public commitment. Kranz didn't just hope everyone would do their jobs. No way. He broke the massive problem down into smaller pieces and gave people explicit ownership. You are in charge of power. You are in charge of life support. These weren't things whispered in a corner. They were public declarations in front of everybody. That creates this incredible peer pressure, where nobody wants to be the person who lets the team down.
But let's be real. No plan is ever perfect. The moment it hits the real world, something's going to break. New problems pop up, and that brings us to the final and maybe most important part of the loop: making revisions.
So, they're in the lunar module, and suddenly a new alarm goes off. The air is becoming toxic. The carbon dioxide levels are rising. Kranz didn't freak out. He didn't throw the whole plan out the window. He just focused his team with that simple command, let's work the problem. That is the mindset of course correction. The problem? They had these square CO2 filters from the dead command module, but they needed to fit them into the round openings in the lunar module. So what did they do? They literally dumped a box of random stuff, duct tape, plastic bags, hoses, onto a table and told the engineers, invent a solution now. That wasn't a failure of the plan. It was a brilliant revision within the plan.
So, we've walked through this incredible 4-step playbook, but it makes you wonder, right? Why were they so good at it? How could this team run that loop so flawlessly under that kind of pressure? What was the secret sauce?
Because at the end of the day, a playbook is just a set of instructions. What really matters is the team using it. And the success of Apollo 13 wasn't some lucky break. It was the direct result of a very specific culture, one that had been carefully and deliberately built years before anyone even said the words, "Houston, we've had a problem."
So how do you build a culture like that? Well, Professor Sumantra Ghoshal points to 4 big levers. Think about it like this. Instead of just putting limits on people, a constraint strategy, NASA gave them a huge stretch goal: land a man on the moon. Instead of people just following rules to stay out of trouble or compliance, they had disciplined processes they believed in. Their teams weren't just a bunch of contracts, they were built on deep trust. And the leadership style wasn't about command and control, it was about support. NASA was a masterclass in this.
And if you want proof that this was all intentional, look no further. This is a quote from a speech Gene Kranz gave years before Apollo 13, after a fire killed 3 astronauts on the launch pad. He stood up and defined their new culture in just 2 words: tough and competent. Tough meant radical accountability, no excuses. Competent meant you better know your stuff inside and out. This wasn't just a motivational poster. This was the code. It was their operating system. So when the crisis finally came, they were ready. This was who they were.
Now, this whole idea of building a tough and competent culture, it's not just for NASA. It's not just for life or death missions. The exact same principle of relentless, disciplined improvement can absolutely transform any team in any field. Let's look at a totally different example from the world of sports.
So check this out. For decades, the British cycling team was, well, they were pretty much a joke, totally mediocre. Then, this new performance director, a guy named Dave Brailsford, takes over. And his approach was so simple it was almost deceptive, but it was incredibly powerful. He started a cultural revolution based on an idea he called the aggregation of marginal gains.
His whole philosophy was boiled down to one number: 1%. The rule was simple: find a 1% improvement in absolutely everything you do. They made the bike seats a tiny bit more comfortable. They found tires that were 1% lighter. They tested different massage gels to see which one led to faster muscle recovery. They'd even brought their own pillows to hotels to make sure the athletes got a 1% better night's sleep. Now, any one of those things is tiny, almost unnoticeable. But when you add up hundreds of these 1% improvements, the effect isn't additive, it's multiplicative. It creates a massive leap in performance, and pretty soon, they were dominating the Olympics, winning gold medal after gold medal.
So you're probably thinking, what does a 50-year-old space mission have to do with a cycling team? Well, they both point to the same powerful truth. Our finest hours, our greatest successes, they don't just happen by luck. They are the direct, almost inevitable result of the culture we choose to build, day in and day out. So here's the big takeaway. The lesson from Apollo 13 is that a tough and competent culture is what allows a team to run that execution loop when everything is on fire. And the lesson from British cycling is that you build that culture with a relentless focus on those small 1% gains. It's about a commitment to continuous improvement. So the question I want to leave you with is this: what is the 1% improvement you can make for your team starting today?